There are survival horror games that set the standard, and then there are games that exist in the shadow of that standard, quietly doing things that nobody seems to talk about anymore. Resident Evil is one of those franchises where everyone knows the mansion, the zombies, Nemesis chasing you through Raccoon City, and Leon's one-liners. But beneath all that cultural memory, beneath the remakes and the blockbuster action pivots, there's a layer of design brilliance that shaped not just horror gaming, but game design itself. Tonight we're going to explore those parts of Resident Evil that rarely get discussed. The mechanics, the philosophies, the quiet genius that made this series revolutionary in ways that go far beyond the obvious. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this deep dive into gaming, hit that like button to help other fans discover this video. And let me know down in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing our late night crew check in from all over the globe, sharing this moment in the dark. So get comfortable, dim the lights if you can, and let's begin. The thing about Resident Evil is that it arrived in 1996 and crystallized something. Survival horror existed before it. Alone in the Dark laid much of the groundwork back in 1992, but Resident Evil took those ideas and refined them into a formula so effective that it defined an entire genre for the next decade. And yet, when we talk about what made it work, the conversation almost always stops at the surface level. We mention the fixed camera angles, the tank controls, the limited inventory, the save ribbons. We talk about the atmosphere, the mansion, the iconic moments like the dog jumping through the window or the first zombie turning around with flesh hanging from its mouth. But we rarely dig into why those choices worked. We don't talk about the philosophy underpinning the design, the way Capcom understood player psychology in ways that most developers at the time didn't. We don't discuss how Resident Evil created a language of spatial design that influenced everything from Silent Hill to Dead Space to The Last of Us. And we certainly don't give proper credit to the way Resident Evil taught an entire generation of game designers that limitations can be features, that what you don't show is as important as what you do, and that making players feel capable but not powerful is the key to sustained tension. Tonight we're going to change that. We're going to walk through the Spencer Mansion, through Raccoon City, through every dark corridor and every save room, and examine what Resident Evil did that nobody talks about anymore. The design choices that were so effective they became invisible. The mechanical innovations that were copied so thoroughly they lost their association with the source. The philosophical approaches to horror that shaped how we think about fear in interactive media. And here's what you need to understand going in. Until you realize that Resident Evil wasn't just trying to scare you, it was trying to make you complicit in your own fear, teaching you to make impossible choices and live with the consequences, then you haven't really understood what made this series special. The horror wasn't in the monsters. It was in the decisions the game forced you to make when you knew every option was wrong. The architecture of dread. Let's start with something everyone thinks they understand but nobody really examines properly: the Spencer Mansion. When you think about Resident Evil's setting, you probably picture a spooky old mansion with zombies wandering the halls. And yes, that's accurate on the surface. But what made the Spencer Mansion brilliant wasn't that it was scary. It was designed like a puzzle box that slowly revealed its internal logic, teaching you to navigate it through repeated failure and hard-won spatial awareness. The mansion is not a realistic space. Nobody would actually build a residence with the layout the Spencer Mansion has. Doors that require crest keys and strange emblems. Hallways that loop back on themselves in ways that violate architectural sense. rooms that serve no clear residential purpose but make perfect sense as gameplay spaces. And yet, despite this unreality, the mansion feels coherent. It has an internal consistency that lets you build a mental map, lets you learn its geography, lets you develop strategies for navigation that account for where enemies spawn and where resources are located. This is the first piece of genius that nobody talks about. The Spencer Mansion is unrealistic in service of being gameable. Capcom understood that horror works better when players can develop competence, when they can learn and improve and feel like they're mastering a space. If the mansion were truly random, truly unpredictable, players would feel frustrated rather than frightened. But by giving the mansion rules, by making it learnable, Capcom created an environment where fear comes not from confusion but from knowledge. You know the dog hallway, you know what's waiting there, and you have to walk down it anyway because there's no other route. Compare this to how most horror games at the time approached level design. They created linear paths with scripted scares. You'd walk down a corridor, something would jump out, you'd react, and then you'd move forward to the next scripted moment. This works for a single playthrough, but it has no replayability, because once you know when the scares happen, they lose their power. The Spencer Mansion doesn't rely on scripted scares. It relies on spatial knowledge creating dread. You know where the threats are, and that knowledge doesn't make you feel safer. It makes you feel trapped, because you know what's coming and you have to face it anyway. The interconnectedness of the mansion deserves special attention. Unlike modern games that often use hub and spoke design where you return to a central safe area and branch out to different zones, a Spencer Mansion is a web of interconnected rooms and hallways. There are multiple routes to most destinations. Shortcuts unlock as you progress. Keys open doors that connect previously separate areas. This creates a spatial complexity that rewards exploration and memory. But here's what's brilliant about this design. It makes resource management spatial as well as numerical. You don't just have to manage how many bullets you have. You have to manage where you are in the mansion relative to where your resources are. You used your last healing item 3 rooms ago, and now you're facing enemies, and you have to decide whether to backtrack to the item box or push forward hoping to find something, or avoid combat entirely. The mansion's layout transforms every decision about resource use into a spatial calculation, adding a layer of strategic depth that pure inventory management couldn't achieve alone. The save rooms are the perfect counterpoint to this interconnected danger. Every save room in Resident Evil has the same music, the same general aesthetic of safety, and most importantly, the guarantee that no enemies will appear there. These rooms become psychological anchors. When you hear that save room music, your nervous system responds. You can breathe, you can think, you can make decisions without the pressure of immediate threat. But the brilliance is in the scarcity and placement of these rooms. They're not so common that you can always duck into one when threatened. They're positioned such that reaching one often requires navigating dangerous spaces, and the fact that saving requires ink ribbons, a limited resource, means that even the act of saving becomes a decision with weight. Do you save now using a ribbon, or do you push forward hoping to reach the next save room with more progress to preserve? This transforms saving from a user interface convenience into a gameplay decision, making even the meta action of preserving your progress part of the horror experience. The fixed camera angles that everyone loves to criticize were actually serving multiple purposes that few people acknowledge. Yes, they were partially a technical solution, allowing Capcom to use pre-rendered backgrounds that looked better than real-time three-dimensional environments on PlayStation hardware. but they were also a deliberate tool for controlling player experience in ways that free camera systems can't achieve. A fixed camera lets the designers control exactly what you see and when you see it. They can hide enemies around corners that the camera angle deliberately obscures. They can create moments where you enter a room and the camera shows you something in the distance, drawing your attention, while danger lurks in the foreground that you won't notice until you move closer. They can use camera transitions, those moments when you move through a door and the perspective shifts, to create brief instances of disorientation where you're not quite sure which direction you're facing anymore. This last point is more important than it seems. Those camera transitions that momentarily confuse your spatial orientation serve a crucial function. They prevent you from ever becoming too comfortable with navigation. In a game with a free camera, once you learn a space, you can navigate it with total confidence. Your spatial awareness is never compromised. But in Resident Evil, every door you go through requires a moment of reorientation. You have to look at the new camera angle, figure out where your character is in the frame, remember which direction you are facing, and adjust your mental model accordingly. This creates persistent low-level cognitive load. You're never quite on autopilot. You always have to pay attention, always have to think about where you are and where you're going, and that sustained attention is what keeps the tension high even in areas you've been through multiple times. The camera isn't just showing you the mansion, it's making you work to understand the mansion, frame by frame, angle by angle, room by room. The loading screens hidden behind door opening animations are another piece of genius that's been criticized for decades, but was actually a perfect solution to multiple problems. On a technical level, yes, they were loading the next room and unloading the previous one, managing memory on hardware that couldn't hold entire areas at once. But experientially, they created rhythm. Every time you open a door in Resident Evil, there's a beat, a pause, a moment of anticipation where you don't know what's on the other side. Will there be enemies? Will it be a save room? Will it be empty? That door animation transforms every transition between spaces into a moment of suspense. It's the horror equivalent of a scene transition in film, giving you just enough time to wonder what comes next. Modern games with instant transitions between rooms can't create this feeling. When you can see through doorways into the next space, when you can run through without pause, navigation becomes smooth and seamless. That smoothness is good for many types of games, but it's antithetical to survival horror. Horror requires friction. It requires moments where you have to commit to a choice, where you have to open a door and step through not knowing what waits on the other side, where you have to live with the consequences of moving forward. The Spencer Mansion and later Raccoon City's police station, apartments, and sewers represent a philosophy of horror-level design that's almost extinct now. These are spaces designed to be learned, mastered, and still feared. They're spaces where knowledge doesn't equal safety. They're spaces that respect player intelligence enough to make them work for understanding, and reward that work with the grim satisfaction of competence in the face of overwhelming threat. And here's what almost nobody discusses. This design philosophy influenced everyone. When you play Dead Space and you're navigating the USG Ishimura's interconnected corridors, learning shortcuts and safe routes, that's Resident Evil's influence. When you play Dark Souls and you're discovering how Lordran connects to itself, unlocking elevators and gates that reveal you've been circling the same space in different ways, that's Resident Evil's influence. When you play The Last of Us and you're moving through environments that reward spatial memory and cautious exploration, that's Resident Evil's influence. The Spencer Mansion taught game designers that horror spaces should be designed like characters. They should have personality, internal logic, and the capacity to be known while still remaining threatening. They should reward attention while punishing carelessness. They should feel purposeful even when they're impossible, coherent even when they're unrealistic, meaningful even when they're just rooms and hallways in a video game. This is the architecture of dread, not just making spaces that look scary, but designing spaces that create fear through their structure, their layout, their relationship to your resources and your capabilities. The Spencer Mansion succeeded not because it was a scary mansion, but because it was a space that made you afraid of your own limitations every time you had to navigate it. The weight of choice. If you ask most people what made Resident Evil difficult, they'll talk about scarce resources and dangerous enemies. And they're not wrong, exactly. But that's not what made the game's difficulty meaningful. What made Resident Evil special was that it transformed resource scarcity from a mechanical challenge into an emotional one. It made you feel the weight of every decision, not just strategically, but morally, psychologically, even philosophically. Let's examine the core loop. You have limited inventory space, maybe 6 or 8 slots depending on your character. You have limited ammunition, limited healing items, limited everything. Enemies exist throughout the environment, and while you can kill them, doing so costs resources. The game is constantly asking you a simple question: is this worth it? Is it worth spending 2 handgun bullets to kill this zombie? Or should you try to run past it and risk taking damage? If you take damage, is it worth using a healing item now, or should you save it for a harder encounter later? If you use a healing item, are you willing to carry fewer weapons or key items to make room for additional medicine? Every single action you take has opportunity cost, and Resident Evil forces you to feel that cost constantly. This is fundamentally different from how most games approach difficulty. In something like Dark Souls, the difficulty comes from execution. You need good timing, pattern recognition, and mechanical skill to succeed. But once you have those skills, once you've learned the enemy, patterns, and boss strategies, the game becomes manageable. Your capability increases. You get better. Resident Evil doesn't work that way. You can become more skilled at aiming, more efficient at dodging, better at navigation, but you never escape the fundamental resource economy. You never reach a point where bullets are plentiful or healing items are abundant. No matter how good you get at the game, you're still making the same fundamental decisions about resource allocation. The game keeps you in a state of perpetual scarcity, where every action has weight. The item box system is central to this philosophy. Unlike games where you have unlimited inventory and can carry everything you find, Resident Evil forces you to choose. When your inventory is full and you find something new, you have to decide what to drop or leave behind. When you're heading into a dangerous area, you have to decide which weapons to bring, how much ammunition to carry, how many healing items to pack, and which key items you might need. And here's the stroke of genius. The item boxes are linked. Everything you store in one box is accessible from any other box. This means you're never locked out of resources you've collected, but it also means that planning matters. If you stored all your shotgun ammunition in the mansion's East Wing save room and you're now in the guardhouse without a shotgun, that's a consequence of your earlier decision. The game respects your choices enough to let you make mistakes and trusts you to learn from them. This creates a style of gameplay that's almost extinct in modern design. You have to think ahead. You have to plan routes. You have to consider not just what you need now, but what you might need later. You have to evaluate risk not just in the moment, but across the entire trajectory of your playthrough. This is strategic horror, where the planning phase is as important as the execution phase, where thinking through your approach matters as much as your reflexes. The decision to fight or flee is the most fundamental choice the game offers, and it's one that most players don't consciously recognize they're making dozens of times per playthrough. Traditional action games are built around combat. You're supposed to fight enemies, that's the core verb, the primary interaction. Even in action games with stealth elements, combat is usually the intended solution, and stealth is the optional challenge modifier. Resident Evil inverts this. Fighting is always an option, but it's rarely the best option. Every bullet you fire is a bullet you won't have later. Every healing item you use is one less in your inventory for a boss fight. The game teaches you, through resource pressure, that sometimes the smart choice is to run past enemies, taking a hit if necessary, preserving your resources for situations where combat is mandatory. This creates a beautiful tension. You have weapons. You can fight. But should you? That zombie in the hallway isn't a challenge to overcome through skill. It's a question to answer through judgment. Can I get past without taking damage? If I take damage, is that acceptable, given my current health and healing items? Is there a reason I need this hallway to be clear, or can I just avoid this enemy every time I pass through? The game never explicitly teaches you this. There's no tutorial that says, hey, you can just run past enemies sometimes. You discover it through necessity, through running low on ammunition and realizing you have to conserve, through experimenting with dodging around zombies instead of shooting them. And once you learn it, once you internalize that combat is optional in many situations, your entire relationship with the game changes. You stop seeing enemies as obstacles to overcome and start seeing them as hazards to navigate. You start planning routes that minimize enemy contact. You start thinking about which enemies you absolutely must kill, maybe the ones in narrow hallways where running past is too dangerous, and which ones you can safely ignore. You become strategic in your violence, and that strategic choice makes the violence meaningful when it occurs. The boss fights are where this philosophy inverts. In regular encounters, you're conserved, careful, avoiding combat when possible. But bosses are mandatory combat that you cannot avoid. And because you've been conserving resources through the entire area leading up to the boss, you should have enough ammunition and healing items to win the fight. The game is teaching you resource rhythm. Conserve during exploration, spend during bosses, repeat. But here's where player skill and judgment separate success from failure. If you overconserved, if you take too much damage in regular encounters, trying to avoid spending resources, you might enter a boss fight low on health with fewer healing items than you need. If you underconserved, if you killed too many regular enemies, you might have full health but insufficient ammunition to kill the boss. The game is constantly balancing you on this razor's edge where both extremes lead to failure and the correct path is the middle way that requires constant judgment. This is what I mean by the weight of choice. Every decision has consequences. Every bullet you fire now is a bullet you don't have later. Every healing item you use now is one you can't use in the future. Every key item you carry is a weapon or ammunition slot you're giving up, and the game never relieves this pressure. It never gives you enough resources to stop making hard choices. It keeps you in a state of perpetual evaluation where every action requires thought. The multiple characters with different abilities add another layer to this design philosophy. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine don't just have different stories, they have different resource economies. Chris has more health and stronger attacks but smaller inventory. Jill has more inventory space and access to the grenade launcher but lower health. This means the same playthrough on the same difficulty setting is fundamentally different depending on which character you choose, because resource management has different constraints. Chris players have to be more aggressive in combat because they can take more hits, but they have to be more selective about what they carry because space is limited. Jill players have more flexibility in loadout but have to be more cautious in combat because they can't absorb as much damage. The game is teaching you that different capabilities require different strategies, that there's no single correct way to manage resources, and that adaptation is survival. This philosophy extended through the entire classic Resident Evil series. Resident Evil 2 refined it with the A and B scenario system, where your resource choices in the first scenario affected what was available in the second. Resident Evil 3 added the dodge mechanic and randomized elements, making some decisions reactive rather than planned. Code Veronica increased the resource pressure by limiting what was carried between characters. Each entry iterated on the core philosophy. Meaningful choices under scarcity create compelling horror. And then Resident Evil 4 arrived and changed everything. The shift to over-the-shoulder action, the merchant system that let you buy and sell equipment, the abundant resources that encouraged combat rather than avoidance. These changes made for an excellent game, but it was a different type of game. The weight of choice was still present, but it had transformed from resource economics to tactical positioning. You still made decisions, but they were moment-to-moment combat decisions rather than long-term, strategic ones. Whether you prefer the classic formula or the modern approach is personal taste. But what's inarguable is that the classic Resident Evil games pioneered a design philosophy that few games have matched since. They proved that making players feel the weight of their choices, that forcing constant evaluation of opportunity cost, that designing around scarcity rather than abundance could create sustained tension that never fully resolves. When you finally defeat the final boss in Resident Evil, when you're running through the mansion as it self-destructs, you're not thinking about how powerful you've become or how many enemies you've vanquished. You're thinking about whether you have enough healing items to survive the escape, whether you should take one more hit to save that last first aid spray, whether you can make it to the exit before time runs out. Right up until the final moment, the game is asking you to make choices under pressure, asking you to evaluate costs and benefits, asking you to live with the consequences of every decision you've made since you first entered the mansion. That's the weight of choice, not just making decisions, but feeling them, carrying them, living with them. And very few games have ever done it better than classic Resident Evil. The language of rooms. There's a concept in architecture called legibility, the idea that a space should communicate its purpose through its design. A kitchen looks like a kitchen, a bedroom looks like a bedroom. The physical characteristics of the space tell you what's supposed to happen there. Resident Evil understood this concept and weaponized it for horror. Every room type in Resident Evil has a visual language, and once you learn that language, you can predict what you'll find and what will be expected of you. Save rooms have warm lighting, typewriters, item boxes, and that iconic music. You know instantly that you're safe. Puzzle rooms have specific aesthetic markers, ornate decorations, obvious focal points, mechanisms that clearly need interaction. Combat arenas are usually larger spaces with multiple entry points and less environmental detail. Regular hallways and transition spaces have minimal lighting and that ever-present sense of danger. This visual language does several things simultaneously. First, it helps with the navigation and spatial memory. When you remember that there's a save room on the second floor east wing, your brain is associating not just a location but a feeling, a sound, a visual aesthetic. Memory becomes multisensory, which makes the mansion easier to remember and navigate. Second, it creates expectations that the game can then play with. Once you learn that save rooms are safe, The few times the game violates that expectation hit with incredible force. When a cutscene shows a monster breaking through a save room door, or when you hear sounds outside a save room that suggest something's trying to get in, it's frightening specifically because it threatens the one space you've been conditioned to trust. Third, and most importantly, the language of rooms creates pacing through spatial variety. You're not just moving through generic corridors, you're moving through spaces that have different rules, different feelings, different gameplay implications. A save room offers relief and planning. A puzzle room offers challenge without immediate danger. A combat arena demands focus and resource expenditure. Transition hallways offer constant threat. This variety keeps the experience from becoming monotonous while maintaining consistent tension. The puzzle rooms deserve special attention because they represent a design philosophy that's largely disappeared from modern horror games. These are spaces where combat stops, where you're not in immediate danger, but where you have to solve an environmental challenge to progress. The mechanisms are often elaborate, musical instruments that must be played in sequence, paintings that need to be arranged correctly, elaborate lock mechanisms requiring multiple items combined in specific ways. Modern design wisdom says these puzzles break immersion. Why would anyone design a mansion where you need 4 gemstones in specific slots to open a door? Why would a police station have puzzles involving chess pieces and paintings? It's unrealistic, it's gamey, it disrupts the horror atmosphere with abstract problem solving. But this criticism misses the function these puzzles serve. They're not trying to be realistic, they're trying to create rhythm. After navigating dangerous spaces, after making tense decisions about resource use, after the sustained stress of moving through enemy filled corridors, the puzzle rooms offer a different kind of challenge. They give you something to focus on besides survival. They let you use a different part of your brain. And crucially, they extend playtime in a way that feels earned. If every door opened with a key and every path forward was just about walking there, the game would be over in an hour or two. The puzzles force you to explore, to backtrack, to think about the environment and how its pieces connect. They transform the mansion from a location you pass through into a space you inhabit, a puzzle box you gradually understand. The rewards for solving these puzzles are usually key items or access to new areas, which means puzzle progression and spatial progression are the same thing. Solving the puzzle isn't a distraction from advancing through the game, it is advancing through the game. This integration means puzzles never feel like they're wasting your time. Every solution earned is progress made. The item description system is another aspect of room language that rarely gets discussed. Every item you pick up in Resident Evil has a description you can read in your inventory. For key items and documents, these descriptions provide hints about where the item should be used or what information it contains. For weapons and healing items, they provide practical information about effectiveness and usage. But the brilliance is that these descriptions are written in a specific tone, clinical, informative, sometimes slightly ominous. Reading them doesn't break immersion because they're styled like something your character would actually be thinking or observing. A chemical used to create an antidote isn't just a mechanical description. It's presented as your character's assessment of an object they're examining. This system does several things. It ensures players are never completely stuck because examining items provides hints about their purpose. It rewards attention and thoroughness because reading descriptions might reveal information that's not immediately obvious. And it maintains atmosphere because even the user interface is styled to fit the game's tone. The environmental storytelling embedded In room design is where Resident Evil truly excels in ways that influence decades of subsequent games. You enter a room and see overturned furniture, blood on the walls, claw marks on the doors. Nobody has to tell you a story about what happened here. The room itself is the story. You enter a laboratory and see containment tanks broken from the inside, research notes scattered on desks, emergency lights still flashing. The narrative is environmental. This technique wasn't invented by Resident Evil. Games have been telling stories through environments since the medium began, but Resident Evil refined it into a consistent language and proved that environmental storytelling could carry significant narrative weight in a three-dimensional action game. You could understand the full scope of the outbreak, the mansion's true purpose, and the Umbrella Corporation's crimes through nothing but careful observation of your surroundings. Modern games have run with this technique. The entire BioShock series is built around environmental narrative. The Last of Us uses environmental storytelling extensively to show societal collapse and personal tragedies. Dark Souls uses item placement and descriptions to tell its fractured narrative. But Resident Evil proved the concept could work in a mainstream commercial game, could serve both gameplay and narrative simultaneously, and could create atmosphere while providing information. The way rooms connect to each other matters as much as the rooms themselves. Resident Evil uses locked doors, collapsed passages, and item-gated progressions to control your path through the space. You can see a door early in the game that you can't open yet, and that door becomes a mental bookmark. You know there's more to explore in that direction once you find the right key or solve the right puzzle. This creates a satisfying sense of gradual mastery over the space. Early in the game, most of the mansion is locked to you. You can only access a few rooms, a few hallways, but as you find keys, as you solve puzzles, as you defeat bosses, more areas open up. The mansion physically expands as you progress, and because the layout is interconnected, opening a new area often means creating a shortcut that connects back to somewhere you've already been, making navigation easier even as challenges escalate. This philosophy of spatial progression has become standard in game design, but it was revolutionary in 1996. The idea that a game space could be a locked puzzle box that gradually opens, that physical progression could be gated behind puzzles and key items rather than just combat encounters, that a single large environment could serve as the setting for an entire game. These concepts were new, or at least newly refined, for three-dimensional console gaming. The language of rooms in Resident Evil created a template. It showed that horror games could be spatial puzzles. It proved that environmental variety within a consistent aesthetic could maintain interest across hours of gameplay. It demonstrated that teaching players to read room types and extract information from environmental details could create depth without requiring complex mechanics. And here's what nobody talks about: this language made horror intimate. Instead of vast, sprawling campaigns across multiple locations, Resident Evil gave you one mansion. You learned it. You knew it. By the end of the game, you could navigate many sections without consulting the map because the rooms had become familiar, and that familiarity didn't reduce fear. It complicated it because you knew what dangers waited in familiar spaces and had to face them anyway. The Spencer Mansion became a character in its own right, not through some abstract narrative device, but through the simple fact of legibility. You understood its language. You could read its rooms. You knew its rules. And that knowledge made you complicit in your own horror because you couldn't blame the game for surprising you. You knew what was there. You chose to open that door anyway. The mansion didn't trick you. It spoke clearly in the language of rooms. and you understood every word. The sound of silence. When people discuss Resident Evil's audio design, they usually mention the iconic save room theme, the groans of zombies, or maybe the menu sound effects that became synonymous with the series. But what they rarely discuss is how Resident Evil understood something fundamental about horror sound design that most games still haven't figured out. Silence is a weapon. Walk through the Spencer Mansion and pay attention to what you hear during normal gameplay. Footsteps echoing on marble floors, the creak of doors opening, wind howling through broken windows, and beneath all of that, often for minutes at a time, nothing. No music, no ambient drone, just environmental sounds and emptiness. This was a radical choice in 1996. Most games filled every moment with music or ambient sound, operating under the assumption that silence meant something was wrong with the audio system. Players expected constant sonic reinforcement. Film had taught audiences that scary scenes need scary music. Why would a horror game choose silence when it could be filling that space with ominous strings or industrial noise? Because silence creates anticipation. When you're walking through an empty hallway hearing nothing but your own footsteps, your brain starts working overtime. Every small sound becomes magnified. A distant creak makes you stop and listen. A faint groan from another room sends your threat assessment into overdrive. You're not being told what to feel through musical cues. You're creating your own tension through the act of listening, straining to hear danger before it arrives. The save room music becomes precious specifically because of this silence. Those gentle piano notes, that melancholic melody, they signal safety not just through their sound but through their contrast to the silence everywhere else. When you've been walking through quiet corridors for 10 minutes, hearing that save room theme is like taking a breath you didn't know you were holding. The relief isn't just that you're safe from enemies, it's that the silence has finally ended, that something gentle is filling that oppressive quiet. Capcom understood dynamic range in audio design. In music production, dynamic range is the difference between the quietest and loudest parts of a recording. Songs with high dynamic range have soft parts and loud parts, and the contrast between them creates emotional impact. Songs with low dynamic range, where everything is compressed to similar volume levels, lose that emotional variation. Resident Evil applied this principle to game audio. Long stretches of near silence punctuated by sudden loud sounds, gunshots, zombie groans, doors slamming. The contrast creates an impact that constant noise never could. When a Cerberus crashes through a window, it's startling not just because dogs shouldn't come through windows, but because it's a sudden violent sound breaking through sustained quiet. The enemy sound design works in service of this philosophy. Zombies have distinctive groans that echo through hallways, giving you audio warning of their presence. But those groans are intermittent. A zombie doesn't groan constantly. It groans, then silence, then groans again. This creates anticipation. You heard something. Where is it? How close? Is it moving toward you or away? The silence between sounds forces you to guess, to extrapolate, to imagine. Hunters have that distinctive clicking sound, and hearing it creates instant dread for anyone who's played Resident Evil before. But notice how the game introduces that sound. You first hear it before you see your first hunter. You're walking through a hallway, and you hear this rapid clicking echo from somewhere ahead. You don't know what makes that sound yet. Your brain is trying to categorize it. Is it mechanical? Organic? What could move fast enough to make that staccato rhythm? And then you turn a corner and see a hunter for the first time, and the sound suddenly has a source, and that source is terrifying. This is audio design creating memory. From that moment forward, hearing Hunter clicks triggers a physiological response. Your heart rate increases, your attention sharpens, you ready a weapon or prepare to run. The sound itself has become frightening because of the association your brain formed between that sound and that threat. Capcom didn't need to make the clicking sound inherently scary. They just needed to connect it to danger, and your own mind did the rest. The typewriter sound in save rooms deserves recognition as one of gaming's most effective audio cues. It's not just pleasant to hear, it's functionally informative. When you save, you hear that mechanical clicking of typewriter keys, that satisfying final ding when the save completes. This creates Pavlovian association. The typewriter sound means progress preserved, risk mitigated, a checkpoint reached. And because saving costs ink ribbons, because it's a decision with resource cost, that typewriter sound represents not just saving, but the choice to save. You heard that sound because you decided it was worth spending a ribbon. Every time you hear it, you're being reminded that you made a strategic choice, and that choice was validated by the completion of the save. This transforms a simple UI sound into an emotionally resonant moment. The voice acting in the original Resident Evil has been mocked for decades, and some of that criticism is fair. The performances are stilted, the dialogue is awkward, and some line deliveries are genuinely bizarre. But here's what rarely gets acknowledged: that uncanny quality to the voice work actually serves the horror in unexpected ways. When characters speak in slightly unnatural cadences, when line delivery feels just a bit off, it creates subtle wrongness. These people don't sound quite right. The performances exist in this space between naturalistic acting and something artificial, and that artificiality makes everything feel slightly dreamlike, slightly unreal. You're never quite grounded in absolute realism, which means the supernatural elements feel more at home in this slightly off world. The remakes fixed the voice acting, made it genuinely good, naturalistic, and compelling. But something was lost in that transition. The original's weird performances were part of its identity, part of what made it feel like you were playing through something strange and other. The remake's performances ground you in reality, which makes for better drama, but different horror. The sound of reloading weapons, the mechanical clicks and slides, these were recorded with significant weight. When you reload, you hear every component of that action: the magazine sliding out, the new magazine sliding in, the slide racking. These sounds are satisfying in a tactile way, making the act of reloading feel substantial. But they also serve as audio feedback that takes time, reinforcing that reloading leaves you vulnerable, that these seconds of weapon maintenance are seconds you're not able to defend yourself. Compare this to action games where reloading is nearly instant, where the audio is compressed into a quick sound effect that barely registers. Resident Evil makes you feel reloading, makes it a moment of exposure, uses sound to reinforce mechanical vulnerability. You hear yourself preparing to fight, and that preparation time becomes tension. The ambient environmental sounds vary by location in ways that create sonic identity for different areas. The mansion has that wind howling through broken windows, creaking wood, distant thunder. The underground laboratory has machinery humming, steam venting, electronic hums. The guardhouse has rain on the roof, water dripping, floorboards groaning. Each area has its own sonic palette, which helps with navigation and memory. You remember places partially by what they sound like. This technique of using ambient sound to create location identity became standard practice in game design. Every area in Dead Space has distinctive audio. The different zones in BioShock have unique sonic characteristics. But Resident Evil was early in understanding that players remember spaces through multiple senses, and audio is crucial to spatial memory. The menu sounds became iconic, those beeps and chirps when you navigate inventory or examine items. They're simple, functional sounds that convey information about menu navigation, but they're also distinctively Resident Evil. Hearing those sounds instantly places you in the franchise's aesthetic space. They became part of the series' audio identity as much as the save room theme or zombie groans. And crucially, menu sounds don't pause gameplay in Resident Evil. When you open your inventory, the game world continues. Zombies can still reach you. Time still passes. This means that even in menus, you're not completely safe. You're managing inventory under potential threat, which means those menu sounds are happening while you're still partially focused on the game world, still listening for danger even as you organize items. The save room theme variations across different games in the series created a musical through line. Each major entry has its own version of that safe, melancholic melody. They sound different, use different instruments, have different arrangements, but they're recognizably connected. This creates sonic continuity across the franchise, a consistent audio signal that means safety regardless of which game you're playing. Resident Evil 2's save room theme has that gentle guitar. Resident Evil 3's version is more somber, more isolated feeling. Code Veronica's rendition has a slightly more modern production, but they all serve the same function. They all trigger the same response, and they're all recognizably part of the same musical family. This is brilliant franchise building through audio design. The final escape sequences in Resident Evil games often introduce music for the first time in extended sequences. When the mansion is self-destructing and you're running toward the exit, music appears. Urgent, dramatic orchestral music that pushes you forward. This is the dynamic range principle applied to entire sections of gameplay. After hours of silence punctuated by environmental sounds and short combat stings, suddenly there's a full musical score. The contrast makes it feel monumental, makes the escape feel epic, specifically because music has been withheld for so long. What Resident Evil taught subsequent horror games is that audio restraint creates impact, that silence is a tool as much as sound, that letting players exist in quiet for extended periods makes the sounds that do occur feel more significant, that creating strong audio associations between sounds and threats lets you trigger fear with just a sound cue. Using audio to create location identity helps with player navigation and memory. The modern Resident Evil games, starting with 4 and continuing through the recent remakes, use audio differently. There's more music, more constant audio presence, more cinematic scoring. This works for the tone those games are going for, the more action-oriented, blockbuster-style horror. But something was lost in that transition. The classic games understood that in horror, what you don't hear is as important as what you do, that the space between sounds is where fear lives, that silence isn't absence, it's presence, and it's listening. The combat that teaches survival. Here's a fact that modern players often struggle with when they return to classic Resident Evil. The combat feels bad, and it does. The aiming is stiff. The tank controls make positioning difficult. Enemies move in unpredictable patterns. Hit detection can feel inconsistent. By modern standards, fighting zombies in the original Resident Evil is clunky, frustrating, and unrewarding. But here's what people miss, that's the point. Resident Evil's combat isn't designed to feel good. It's designed to feel risky, uncertain, and costly. Every encounter is meant to make you question whether fighting is worth it, whether you should spend the resources, whether you might be better off just running past and accepting a hit or two. Combat feels bad because it's teaching you that combat is bad, that violence is expensive, that every fight is a loss even when you win. Let's break down how this works mechanically. The tank controls mean you can't strafe. You have to turn to face a direction, then move forward or backward along that line. This makes dodging difficult. You can't simply sidestep a zombie's lunge. You have to turn away, walk backward, and manage distance. This clumsiness is frustrating if you're expecting action game responsiveness, but it's perfect for survival horror because it makes combat feel dangerous even against slow enemies. The aiming system compounds this. When you ready a weapon, your character enters an aiming stance. You can't move while aiming. You're stationary, committed to this position. The targeting is somewhat auto-assisted, but it's not precise. Headshots aren't consistently possible. You're aiming at center mass, hoping to deal enough damage before the enemy reaches you. This creates tension. Every second you spend aiming is a second the enemy is getting closer. The weapon variety seems to promise escalating power, but actually maintains vulnerability through different resource economies. The handgun has abundant ammunition but is weak, requiring multiple shots to drop most enemies. The shotgun is powerful but ammunition is scarce, and its widespread makes it less efficient at range. The grenade launcher deals massive damage, but every round is precious. The knife is unlimited but requires dangerous proximity. Each weapon asks you to balance power against resource cost, effectiveness against availability. And here's the crucial design choice. Enemies don't die reliably. When you shoot a zombie enough times and it falls, you don't get visual confirmation of permanent death. It might be temporarily down, or it might be truly dead. The only way to know for sure is to burn the body with kerosene and a lighter, which consumes inventory space and limited items, or wait to see if it gets back up. This creates persistent uncertainty. That hallway you cleared might not stay cleared. Those resources you spent might need to be spent again. This zombie revival mechanic, often called Crimson Heads in the remake, forces impossible decisions. Do you spend the additional resources to permanently eliminate a threat in a high traffic area? Do you risk the zombie rising again, potentially in a more dangerous form? Do you simply avoid that hallway entirely, finding alternate routes even if they're longer? There's no correct universal answer. The right choice depends on your resources, your route planning, your risk tolerance. The critical hit system adds another layer of uncertainty. Occasionally, shots will deal significantly more damage or cause enemies to stagger. This isn't entirely random. There are factors like weapon type, distance, and enemy state that influence probability, but from the player's perspective, it feels inconsistent. Sometimes a zombie drops in 3 handgun shots. Sometimes it takes 7. This variance makes it impossible to plan exactly, impossible to know with certainty how much ammunition an encounter will cost. Again, this is intentional design, creating desired emotional response. If combat were consistent, if you knew every zombie always took exactly 4 shots, you could calculate precisely. Every zombie would cost 4 bullets, and resource management would be simple math. The variance forces you to account for uncertainty, to keep buffer resources, to accept that your plans might require more ammunition than you projected. The damage feedback is deliberately ambiguous. Enemies don't have visible health bars. Hit reactions are subtle. A zombie might stagger from a shot or might barely react. You're watching for behavioral cues, waiting for the enemy to fall, but you're never quite sure how close it is to death until it drops. This makes every combat encounter a commitment where you have to keep shooting until the threat ends, unable to precisely calibrate resource expenditure. Boss fights operate differently. providing focused combat challenges where avoidance isn't an option. But even here, the design maintains uncertainty and resource pressure. Boss arenas often include environmental hazards, boss patterns aren't entirely consistent, and you're bringing whatever resources you have left from reaching the boss, which varies wildly between playthroughs and between players. The tyrant fight on the helipad is the perfect example. You enter this fight with whatever ammunition and healing items you've conserved through the entire game. Some players have full loadouts, others are running on fumes. The fight is designed to be completable either way, but it's dramatically different depending on your resources. If you have shotgun ammunition and health items, you can trade damage for faster completion. If you're nearly empty, you have to perfect your dodging, make every shot count, play flawlessly with no margin for error. This creates emergent difficulty scaling. Players who struggled through the game and barely made it to the final boss with minimal resources face a brutal final encounter. Players who efficiently manage resources and reach the end well stocked have a more forgiving fight. But neither feels wrong because the difficulty emerged from your playthrough choices rather than being imposed by the game. The defensive weapons that later games introduced, particularly in the remake of Resident Evil 1, refined this combat philosophy. These were single-use items, daggers or grenades that you could use to escape from enemy grabs. They created another layer of resource decision-making. Do you carry a defensive item in a precious inventory slot for safety? Or do you carry more ammunition and healing items and risk getting grabbed? The dodge mechanic in Resident Evil 3 added player skill expression to the survival formula. With proper timing, you could dodge enemy attacks without taking damage. This created a skill ceiling where experienced players could conserve health through execution, but it didn't remove the fundamental resource pressure because dodging didn't eliminate enemies. You still had to decide whether to fight or flee, whether to spend ammunition or accept the risk of dodging through dangerous areas. What all of these systems have in common is that they make combat unrewarding. You don't want to fight in Resident Evil. You fight when you have to, and you try to avoid it when you can. This is fundamentally different from most games where combat is the primary engagement, the fun part, the reason you're playing. Resident Evil makes combat costly, risky, and unsatisfying, which teaches you that survival means avoiding conflict, preserving resources, choosing discretion over valor. This design philosophy influenced survival horror for years. Silent Hill made combat even worse, making you control an untrained civilian who's terrible at fighting. Fatal Frame removed traditional combat entirely, replacing it with a camera that required vulnerable proximity to ghosts. Amnesia eliminated combat altogether, making hiding your only option. These games learned from Resident Evil that disempowering players in combat creates effective horror. But when Resident Evil 4 shifted to over-the-shoulder action with responsive controls and satisfying combat, it revealed that there was a massive audience appetite for horror games where fighting feels good. The success of 4 led to 5 and 6 becoming more action-focused and pushed the entire industry toward horror games with empowering combat. Even recent Resident Evil remakes, while maintaining resource pressure, have much more responsive and satisfying combat than their original versions. Whether this shift was positive or negative is subjective. The modern games are excellent and have brought new audiences to survival horror, but they're doing something fundamentally different than the classics did. Classic Resident Evil combat taught you that you were vulnerable, that violence was a last resort, that true survival meant avoiding conflict whenever possible. That specific flavor of horror, the horror of being poorly equipped to fight, but having no choice but to try anyway, that's largely disappeared from mainstream horror gaming. The clunky, unsatisfying combat in classic Resident Evil wasn't a technical limitation that needed fixing. It was a deliberate design choice creating specific emotional responses. It was teaching you that you're not an action hero. You're a survivor in a nightmare, and survival means knowing when not to fight. The combat felt bad because bad combat makes you afraid to fight, and fear of combat is survival horror in its purest form. The inventory puzzle. Open your inventory in classic Resident Evil, and you're presented with a grid or list showing limited slots. 6 spaces for Jill Valentine, 8 for Chris Redfield if you find the small key to expand from 6. Every item occupies 1 slot. Weapons, ammunition, healing items, key items, everything. This simple inventory limitation creates one of the most compelling ongoing puzzles in gaming, the inventory management metagame. On the surface, it's straightforward. You have limited space, so you choose what to carry, but the depth emerges from how this limitation interacts with every other system in the game. You need weapons for combat, but weapons are useless without ammunition, so you need both. You need healing items because taking damage is often unavoidable. You need key items to unlock doors and solve puzzles. Suddenly, 6 or 8 slots isn't nearly enough for everything you want to carry. This creates the fundamental inventory question that you're answering constantly throughout your playthrough. What do I need right now versus what might I need later? That key item you just found opens a door somewhere, but you don't know where yet. Do you carry it, dedicating a slot to it until you find its purpose? Or do you store it and risk having to backtrack later when you discover what it's for? The item box system is the pressure release valve that prevents this from becoming impossible. When you reach a save room, you can access your stored items and reorganize your loadout. Everything you've collected is accessible, nothing is permanently lost, but the genius is in the friction. Accessing stored items requires reaching a save room, which requires navigating dangerous spaces. If you realize you need something you stored 3 rooms ago, you have to backtrack through those 3 rooms, retrieve the item, then return to where you were. This creates meaningful decision weight. Every time you store something, you're making a bet about when you'll need it again. Store your shotgun to make room for puzzle items, and you're betting you won't need heavy firepower until you've solved the puzzle and can return to get the shotgun. That bet might be right or might be wrong, and if it's wrong, you pay the cost in time, risk, and potential resource expenditure dealing with threats using inadequate equipment. The key item management becomes its own mini game. Classic Resident Evil games are full of keys, crests, emblems, and various unlock items. Each one opens specific doors or activates specific mechanisms. Early in the game, you're constantly picking up new key items and testing them against locked doors throughout the mansion. The armor key opens doors marked with armor symbols. The shield key opens shield-marked doors. Once you've opened all doors that a specific key unlocks, the game usually lets you discard it, freeing that inventory slot. This creates satisfying progress markers. When you can finally discard a key, you're being told that you've fully explored that tier of progression. You've opened all those doors, explored all those areas, and now you can let go of that item and move forward. It's a small thing, but it creates a tangible sense of advancement. Your inventory becoming lighter with discarded keys is progress made visible. The ammunition types complicate this further. You don't just carry a handgun and shotgun. You carry handgun ammunition, shotgun shells, grenade rounds if Jill. Each ammunition type occupies a slot. This means that even being well armed is expensive in terms of inventory space. Carrying 3 weapons and ammunition for each costs 6 slots, leaving you with maybe 2 slots for healing items and key items. Suddenly, every item pickup requires evaluation. You find a box of handgun bullets. Do you pick them up right now, or do you mark them on your mental map and retrieve them later when you have space? You find an herb. Do you use it immediately even though you're only slightly damaged, or do you carry it in case you take more damage later? Or do you leave it and hope it's still here when you need it? These aren't interesting questions if you have unlimited inventory. They're only compelling because of scarcity. The healing item combination system adds another layer. Green herbs heal partially. Red herbs don't heal alone, but enhance green herbs when combined. Blue herbs cure poison. You can combine multiple herbs to create more effective healing items, but combination requires having the items in your inventory simultaneously. This creates optimization puzzles. Is it better to carry two green herbs separately for two small heals, or combine them into one larger heal, freeing a slot but reducing your total number of healing uses? First aid sprays are the premium healing option, completely restoring health in one inventory slot. But they're rare and precious. The inventory decision becomes, do you carry a first aid spray for emergency full healing, or do you carry multiple herbs that provide more total healing, but in smaller increments and consuming more slots? There's no universally correct answer. It depends on your playstyle, your route planning, and your risk tolerance. The defensive item management in the remake adds another variable. Carrying a dagger or flash grenade provides a defensive option if grabbed by enemies, potentially saving health. But it costs a slot. Is the safety worth the space? Some players always carry defensive items, treating them as essential. Others never bother, preferring to use those slots for more ammunition or healing, and simply accepting the risk of being grabbed. The case in Resident Evil 4 revolutionized the system by introducing spatial inventory management. Items occupy different numbers of grid squares based on their physical size. A handgun might be 2 by 3 squares. Ammunition was 1 square. This created Tetris-style inventory optimization where you could carry more items if you arrange them efficiently. The game even let you rotate items to fit them into available space. This spatial inventory was brilliant because it added a skill component to inventory management. Two players with the same case size could carry different amounts of equipment based on how efficiently they organized items. It also created visual satisfaction. A well-organized case full of neatly arranged weapons and supplies looked good, felt organized, gave a sense of preparedness, even if you were actually close to running out of key resources. But both systems, the slot-based classic inventory and the spatial inventory of 4, were serving the same purpose, forcing constant evaluation of what you carry, making you choose between competing priorities, creating situations where there's no option that gets you everything you want, only different compromises with different strengths and weaknesses. The inventory management connects to exploration in ways that create compelling gameplay loops. You're exploring the mansion, finding items, but your inventory fills up. You have to decide whether to continue exploring with full inventory, potentially finding items you can't pick up, or return to a save room to reorganize, interrupting your exploration momentum. Neither option is wrong, but the friction creates gameplay texture that purely mechanical challenges couldn't achieve. Speedrunners optimize inventory management to an art form. They know exactly which items to carry for each segment, exactly when to visit item boxes, exactly which ammunition types to prioritize. Watching an optimized Resident Evil speedrun, the inventory management is as choreographed as the movement in combat. Every item pickup is planned, every box visit is purposeful, every slot is accounted for. This demonstrates the depth in the system, that there's genuine skill in managing these limited slots across an entire playthrough. Casual players might see inventory limits as annoying restrictions, but they're actually creating the meaningful choice that defines the experience. If you could carry everything, you'd never have to prioritize. You'd pick up every item, carry every weapon, have every option available at all times. You'd be prepared for any situation, which means no situation would be challenging in the right way. The challenge wouldn't be in deciding what to carry, it would only be in execution, in using what you have, by forcing prioritization, by making you choose what to carry and what to leave behind. Resident Evil creates a different kind of challenge, a strategic challenge that happens outside of moment to moment gameplay, a planning challenge that requires understanding the game's structure and anticipating what you'll need, a risk management challenge where you make bets about your future needs based on incomplete information. The inventory puzzle is happening constantly in parallel with every other system. You're navigating spaces, managing resources, making combat decisions, solving environmental puzzles, and simultaneously solving the inventory puzzle of what to carry and when to reorganize. These systems layer on each other, creating complexity through interaction rather than through any single system being particularly complicated. Modern Resident Evil games have generally increased inventory space or made inventory management less restrictive. This makes the games more accessible, less frustrating for players who struggle with resource juggling, but it also fundamentally changes what the games are asking of you. The challenge becomes more about execution and less about planning, more about mechanical skill and less about strategic foresight. Neither approach is inherently better, they're serving different design goals, but it's worth recognizing that the restrictive inventory in classic Resident Evil wasn't just a limitation imposed by old design thinking. It was a deliberate choice creating specific gameplay depth. The inventory was a puzzle you solved across the entire game, one that required constant attention and created meaningful decision making in every play session. That's not a limitation that needed fixing. That's a system working exactly as intended, creating the experience that designers wanted players to have. The save system as survival mechanic. In most video games, saving is a courtesy extended to the player, a quality of life feature that respects your time and lets you preserve progress so you don't have to replay large sections after failure. It's a meta system outside the game's fiction, a concession to the reality that people have limited time and low tolerance for repetition. But Resident Evil looked at saving and asked, what if this was part of the game itself? What if preserving progress was a decision with cost and consequence? The ink ribbon system is deceptively simple. Typewriters scattered throughout the game, always in safe rooms, let you save your progress. But each save consumes one ink ribbon, a limited inventory item you find while exploring. You start with a couple of ribbons and find more throughout the mansion, but they're finite, not impossibly scarce, but limited enough that you can't save after every single encounter or room. You have to choose when saving is worth the cost. This transforms saving from a player convenience into a risk assessment. How much progress have you made since your last save? How difficult was that progress to achieve? How confident are you that you can continue successfully without saving? Are you about to enter a dangerous area where failure is likely? Do you have an ink ribbon available? Or would saving require backtracking to retrieve one from storage? Every save point becomes a decision moment. You've just completed a difficult section, cleared several rooms, found some items, used some resources. The safe room's typewriter is right there. Do you save? If you save, you're spending a ribbon, but guaranteeing you won't have to replay what you just did. If you don't save, you're betting that you'll continue to succeed, that you'll reach the next save opportunity without dying, and you're keeping that ribbon for later. Early in the game, when you don't understand the full scope of the mansion or how many ribbons exist, this decision is agonizing. Every ribbon feels precious. You might save too conservatively, pushing forward without saving and then dying, losing an hour of progress. Or you might save too liberally, using ribbons frequently, and then finding yourself later in the game with none left, forced to complete entire sections without the safety net of saves. The learning curve here is fascinating because it's not about mechanical skill. It's about calibrating your risk tolerance against the game's actual difficulty. As you play more, you learn when saves are crucial, before boss fights, after completing difficult sections, when you've made significant progress with low resources, and you learn when you can skip saves, when you haven't done much since the last save, when you're in relatively safe areas, when you have plenty of health and ammunition. This creates a metagame around save management that runs parallel to all the other resource management systems. You're not just managing health, ammunition, and inventory space. You're also managing save opportunities. And unlike other resources, saves don't help you progress. They only protect progress you've already made. A ribbon spent on saving is a ribbon you could have saved for later when stakes might be higher. The psychological impact of this system is profound. When you die in a game with unlimited saves, you lose time. That's frustrating, but it's abstract frustration. When you die in Resident Evil after making significant progress without saving, you lose tangible progress. That door you unlocked is locked again. That puzzle you solved needs solving again. Those enemies you killed or avoided are back. Those items you carefully managed into optimal inventory configuration need reorganizing. The loss is concrete and comprehensive. This makes death genuinely frightening in a way it rarely is in games. You're not just restarting from a checkpoint, you're being set back to your last deliberate save point, which might be much earlier than the moment you died. The fear of death isn't about seeing a game over screen or losing a life counter. It's about losing progress you worked hard to achieve. This fear makes you play more carefully, more thoughtfully, with more genuine investment in not dying. The placement of typewriters reinforces the safe room philosophy. Every save point is in a room where enemies can't reach you, where you can take your time thinking through decisions without immediate threat. This means that saving is always paired with broader inventory management, loadout planning, and strategic thinking. You're not just hitting a quick save button and moving on. You're stopping, organizing, planning, then consciously deciding whether to spend a ribbon to preserve this moment. The sound design of the save process creates satisfaction when you do choose to save. That typewriter clicking, the keys striking the paper, the final ding when the save completes. It's audio feedback that makes saving feel substantial, like you've accomplished something meaningful. Combined with the resource cost and the deliberate choice required, successfully saving doesn't feel like a routine system interaction. It feels like progress is secured, like you've reached a checkpoint through your decisions and actions. The speedrunning community has a complicated relationship with the save system because optimal play often means minimizing saves to conserve time and resources. High-level runners might complete entire runs with only 2 or 3 saves, using them only before particularly risky sections, or before segments where a death would cost massive time. This demonstrates the depth in the system. There's skill in knowing when you absolutely need to save versus when you can risk continuing without one. But for regular players, the save system creates a personal difficulty calibration. Players who struggle with the combat and navigation might save frequently, spending more ribbons but maintaining more stable progress. Skilled players might save rarely, confident they can reach the next opportunity without dying. The game accommodates both approaches because ribbons exist in sufficient quantity to support frequent saving if needed, but conserving them is also viable. The system has built-in flexibility that lets players find their own balance. The remake of Resident Evil introduced autosaves alongside the ink ribbon system, creating a hybrid approach. You could still use typewriters with ribbons for manual saves, but the game also created automatic saves at key story moments. This reduced the punishment for death without completely removing the save management element. It's a concession to modern expectations while preserving some of the original's design philosophy. Resident Evil 7 returned to save points with limited resources in its Madhouse difficulty mode, showing that Capcom understood the save system wasn't just an artifact of old design, but a tool for creating specific gameplay tension. When you want players to feel genuinely afraid of dying, when you want death to have weight beyond mere frustration, limiting saves is one of the most effective tools available. Other survival horror games experimented with different save system philosophies. Silent Hill used notebooks scattered throughout the world, letting you save freely when you found them, but not carrying save capability with you everywhere. Fatal Frame placed save points at specific mirrors throughout haunted locations. Dead Space used stations that let you save freely, removing resource cost but making saves positional rather than always available. Each approach creates different risk-reward dynamics, but Resident Evil's ink ribbon system remains one of the most elegant. It doesn't make saving impossible or excessively punitive. It just makes it a choice, a decision you have to consciously make with an understanding of the trade-offs. And that choice creates engagement that unlimited saving can never achieve because there's no decision to make when saving costs nothing. The broader lesson here is about how system design can create emotional investment through limitation. Unlimited saves are player-friendly, but they reduce death's impact to time loss. Limited saves make death meaningful, make survival important, make reaching a save room feel like genuine accomplishment. The ink ribbon system teaches that sometimes the best design isn't the most convenient. It's the design that makes you care about the choices you're making and the outcomes of those choices. When you finally complete Resident Evil, when you reach that helicopter and escape the mansion, part of your satisfaction comes from knowing you survived not just the zombies and monsters, but the pressure of managing your saves effectively across the entire playthrough. You made decisions about when to secure progress and when to push forward vulnerable, and the fact that you're seeing the ending means those decisions were good enough. That's a triumph that games with unlimited saves can never quite replicate, because there was never any decision to make, never any risk to manage, never any real possibility that poor planning around saves could end your run. The ink ribbons weren't just a resource to manage, they were confidence made tangible, security you could hold in your inventory, the ability to say, this moment matters enough to preserve it, and have that choice mean something. The unlocks that reward mastery. Once you've completed Resident Evil, the credits roll, and you might think that's the end. But then the results screen appears, showing your completion time, saves used, resources consumed, and it tells you what you've unlocked. Infinite ammunition weapons, new costumes, special game modes, bonus scenarios. Suddenly the game you just completed is revealed as preparation for the real challenge, mastery. The unlock system in classic Resident Evil games is sophisticated in ways that modern achievement systems rarely capture. These aren't cosmetic rewards or meta progression that makes you stronger. These are tools that fundamentally change how you approach the game on subsequent playthroughs, and toys that let you experiment with the systems you've learned. The infinite rocket launcher is the classic example. Complete the game quickly enough, usually under 3 hours, and you unlock a weapon with unlimited ammunition and massive destructive power. This weapon trivializes combat, letting you obliterate any enemy instantly without resource concern. It's pure power fantasy, the antithesis of everything the game taught you about resource conservation and combat avoidance. But here's the brilliance: you already learned those lessons. You already completed the game properly, navigating its resource economy, making hard choices, surviving through careful planning. The infinite rocket launcher isn't letting you skip the intended experience, you already had it. Now you're being rewarded with the ability to replay the game in a completely different emotional register, feeling powerful instead of vulnerable, experimenting instead of surviving. This creates a satisfying emotional arc across multiple playthroughs. Your first run is about fear, scarcity, uncertainty. Your subsequent runs with unlocked weapons are about mastery, abundance, control. You're experiencing the same spaces, the same encounters, but your relationship to them has completely transformed. That hallway that was terrifying on your first playthrough becomes trivial when you're carrying infinite ammunition. The boss that took all your resources is now an obstacle you delete in seconds. The ranking system that determines what you unlock creates natural challenge runs. To get the best ranks and unlock everything, you need to complete the game quickly, with minimal saves, ideally without using special weapons. This means that even after your first successful completion, there are higher peaks to climb. You learn to survive. Now, can you survive efficiently? Can you do it fast? Can you do it flawlessly? These aren't arbitrary challenges imposed by achievement systems. They're organic goals that emerge from understanding the game's systems. Once you know the mansion layout, once you've memorized puzzle solutions, once you understand enemy placements and optimal routes, speed becomes a natural progression. You're not just trying to beat the game, you're trying to beat it elegantly, with precision, demonstrating mastery over every system. The alternate costumes seem frivolous but actually serve an important function. They maintain visual freshness across multiple playthroughs. When you're playing through the same content for the fourth time, seeing Jill in her unlocked costume instead of her default outfit provides just enough novelty to keep the experience from feeling completely stale. It's a small thing, but these small things add up to make replaying feel different even when the content is identical. The bonus modes in later games expanded this philosophy significantly. The fourth survivor in Resident Evil 2 is a perfect example, a short, incredibly difficult scenario where you play as Hunk, fighting through Raccoon City with limited resources and no opportunity to save. It's testing whether you've internalized the game's lessons about resource management, combat prioritization, and route optimization. It's a skill check dressed up as bonus content. The Tofu Survivor takes this to absurd extremes, making you complete the same scenario as a piece of tofu armed only with a knife. It's joke content that's actually a legitimate challenge, forcing you to master dodging and positioning because you can't rely on firearms. Players who beat Tofu Survivor have genuinely mastered the game's systems at a level most players never reach. Resident Evil 3's Mercenaries mode introduced time attack gameplay where you race through sections of Raccoon City, killing enemies to extend your timer, trying to reach the goal before time expires. This transformed survival horror systems into score attack gameplay, recontextualizing all the skills you developed during the campaign into competitive time trials. It was so successful that variations of Mercenaries appeared in almost every subsequent Resident Evil game. These modes demonstrate something crucial. The systems you learned for survival horror are flexible enough to support completely different gameplay styles. The movement, aiming, resource management, and spatial navigation that let you survive the campaign also let you excel at time trials, score attacks, and challenge modes. The game taught you a language, and now it's showing you that language can express many different ideas. The knife only runs and no damage runs that challenge players create for themselves emerge from this unlock and ranking culture. The game provides tools for experimenting with constraint. You can choose to use only certain weapons, to complete sections without taking damage, to impose restrictions that make the game harder. And the ranking system provides some external validation when you succeed, rewarding mastery with tangible unlocks. This creates a progression from survival to mastery that's psychologically satisfying. Your first playthrough, you're barely surviving, making desperate choices, constantly under resource pressure. By your fifth playthrough with unlocked equipment and complete knowledge of the game's systems, you're in total control. You've transformed from victim to expert. That transformation is earned through time and effort, and the unlock system makes it visible and mechanically supported. The new Game Plus concept that's common now owes significant debt to Resident Evil's unlock structure. The idea that completing a game unlocks new tools, options, or modes for subsequent playthroughs, creating a cycle of completion and replaying with increased capability or challenge. This became standard practice across gaming genres, but Resident Evil was early in implementing this loop effectively, in understanding that post-completion content could extend a game's life while rewarding skilled play. Modern games often struggle with this balance. They either make unlocks too powerful, trivializing subsequent playthroughs into boring victory laps, or too cosmetic, providing no meaningful gameplay variation. Resident Evil threaded the needle by offering both powerful toys for casual replaying and challenge modifiers for players seeking difficulty. You could replay casually with infinite weapons, having fun without stress, or you could impose restrictions to make the game harder, chasing better ranks and testing your mastery. The speedrunning community that grew around Resident Evil emerged partially from this unlock culture. The game officially tracked completion time and rewarded fast finishes. This created natural competition, players comparing times, sharing strategies, optimizing routes. Before streaming and online leaderboards made speedrunning a massive community, Resident Evil players were doing local speedruns, trying to beat their own times or their friends' times, pushing efficiency to extremes. The world record progressions in Resident Evil speedrunning over the decades show continuous discovery of optimizations, route improvements, and mechanical exploits that save seconds. The fact that people are still finding new optimizations in a game from 1996 demonstrates the depth in the systems, the skill ceiling, the room for mastery. The unlock system encouraged this by making speed a valued metric, by tracking it officially, by rewarding it tangibly. The recent Resident Evil remakes maintain this unlock philosophy while updating it for modern expectations. The Resident Evil 2 remake has multiple difficulty modes, bonus weapons to unlock, and challenges that reward replaying. Resident Evil 3 remake has shop currency to unlock equipment and a built-in speedrun timer. Resident Evil 4 remake has a new Game Plus that carries over weapons and upgrades. These games understand that the best survival horror campaigns are designed for multiple playthroughs with different experiences each time. What the unlock system teaches game designers is that completion doesn't have to be the end. That single-player narrative games can create replay value through carefully designed incentives. That rewarding mastery with new tools and challenges creates a satisfying progression loop. That players will engage with your content much longer if you give them reasons to replay that go beyond simple achievement completion. The classic Resident Evil unlock philosophy created a specific type of player engagement. You completed the game once, and that was satisfying. But then you saw what could be unlocked, saw the ranks you could achieve, saw the bonus content available, and you wanted to improve. You wanted to see how fast you could complete it. You wanted to try the challenge modes. You wanted to experiment with the new weapons. One playthrough became 5 or 10, each one teaching you something new about the game's systems, each one refining your skills, each one providing different emotional experiences using the same content. That's sophisticated design that respects player time while encouraging deeper engagement. It doesn't force you to replay through arbitrary progression systems or aggressive monetization. It offers rewards that make replaying appealing without making it mandatory. It creates a skill ladder where every player can find their appropriate level of challenge and engagement. And it proves that a tight, focused 8-hour campaign designed for mastery can provide more meaningful playtime than a bloated 40-hour campaign designed for single completion. The fixed perspective as artistic choice. The fixed camera angles in Resident Evil have been debated for nearly 3 decades. Are they a clever artistic choice or a dated technical limitation? The answer, frustratingly for people who want simple narratives, is both. They were partially born from technical necessity. Pre-rendered backgrounds look significantly better than real-time three-dimensional environments on 1996 hardware. But the way Team Capcom used these limitations, the artistic choices they made within this framework, transform constraint into distinctive visual language. Let's start with the most obvious advantage. Pre-rendered backgrounds could contain far more detail, better lighting, and more atmospheric effects than real-time rendering could achieve on the PlayStation. The Spencer Mansion's halls look genuinely beautiful in ways that early three-dimensional games couldn't match. The lighting has depth and shadow complexity. The textures are detailed. The environmental storytelling through object placement and decay is readable. These backgrounds were essentially paintings that characters moved across, and that painterly quality created atmosphere that pure polygons couldn't approach. But more interesting than graphical fidelity is how fixed cameras create cinematic framing. Every room in Resident Evil is composed like a shot in a film. The camera is positioned to show you what the developers want you to see from the angle they want you to see it. Sometimes this creates beauty, a sweeping shot of the mansion's main hall that emphasizes architecture and scope. Sometimes it creates tension, a tight angle on a narrow hallway that limits your view ahead. Sometimes it creates dread, a high angle looking down on your character as they enter a room, making them seem small and vulnerable. This directorial control over perspective means every room has been designed not just spatially, but visually. The developers considered how it would look, how the character would appear in the frame, how threats would be revealed or concealed. This is fundamentally different from games with player-controlled cameras, where the developers can't predict or control what players will look at or how they'll frame their view of any given moment. The famous dog sequence demonstrates this perfectly. You're walking down a hallway, the camera positioned to show you ahead. Windows line the wall to your left. Suddenly, with a loud crash of glass, Cerberus hounds burst through the windows into the hallway with you. It's startling, frightening, effective, but it only works because the camera angle prevented you from seeing the dogs outside the windows before they attacked. If you had camera control, you might have looked out the windows, might have seen the dogs, might have been prepared. The fixed camera ensured surprise by controlling your perspective. This technique appears throughout the game. Enemies positioned just outside the camera's view. Threats revealed only when you move into specific positions. Environmental details placed precisely where the camera angle will draw your eye to them. The fixed perspective isn't just showing you the mansion, it's directing your attention, manipulating your awareness, creating the rhythms of tension and release that define the pacing. The camera transitions between rooms create momentary disorientation that serves the horror. When you go through a door, the perspective shifts to a new angle appropriate for the new room. For a moment, you have to reorient, figure out where your character is in the frame, remember which direction you were walking, adjust your mental model of the space. This brief confusion prevents you from ever getting too comfortable, keeps you engaged with spatial awareness rather than falling into autopilot. The tank controls exist to serve the fixed cameras. If the controls were relative to the camera angle, your input directions would change every time the camera shifted, creating constant control confusion. The tank controls, forward moves your character forward in their facing direction, back moves backward, left and right rotate, stay consistent regardless of camera angle. Once you learn them, they're predictable and reliable even as perspectives shift. Modern players often struggle with tank controls because they're used to relative directional input. Press left on the stick, and the character moves left relative to the camera. Tank controls feel counterintuitive initially, but here's what rarely gets acknowledged. Once mastered, tank controls are actually more consistent than camera relative controls in fixed camera games. Your inputs always mean the same thing regardless of camera angle. There's a learning curve, but it plateaus into competence that camera relative controls in fixed camera games can never achieve because you'd be constantly recalibrating directions. The pre-rendered backgrounds also allowed for environmental storytelling detail that real-time rendering couldn't match. Objects on tables, blood spatter patterns, evidence of violence or struggle, notes and documents scattered in corners. All of this could be placed with care and rendered in detail. Players exploring carefully could extract significant information about what happened in the mansion just by examining the environments. This technique, now called environmental storytelling, was enabled by the fidelity that pre-rendered backgrounds provided. The fixed perspective also creates interesting, dramatic irony. Sometimes the camera shows you threats that your character can't see yet. You're watching from an angle that reveals a zombie in the corner of the room, but your character hasn't turned to see it. This creates tension as you navigate toward the threat you know is there, wondering when the character will notice, preparing for the moment of contact. Films use this technique constantly, showing the audience information that characters don't have, creating suspense through that knowledge gap. Fixed cameras let Resident Evil use the same tool. The visual grammar of camera angles creates subconscious emotional cues. High angles looking down on characters make them seem vulnerable and small. Low angles looking up make spaces seem vast and threatening. Tight angles on narrow corridors create claustrophobia. Wide angles in large rooms create exposure anxiety. You're visible from many directions with nowhere to hide. Capcom used all of these techniques deliberately, crafting each room's camera angle to create specific psychological effects. There's also something to be said for the way fixed cameras create consistent, memorable visual compositions. Iconic moments in Resident Evil are tied to specific camera angles. The main hall's grand staircase shot, the dining room's wide view, the save room's comforting perspective. These images are etched into player memory because they're consistent across playthroughs because everyone saw the same carefully composed shot. In games with free cameras, everyone has different visual memories because everyone framed scenes differently. The limitations of fixed cameras are real and worth acknowledging. Combat can be frustrating when you can't see enemies because they're outside the frame or obscured by the camera angle. Navigation sometimes requires memorizing layouts rather than being able to freely look around. The sudden perspective shifts can occasionally be jarring. These aren't imaginary problems, and they're part of why modern games generally favor player-controlled cameras. But here's what's lost when survival horror moved to free cameras: directorial control, consistent visual composition, the ability to create surprise through perspective manipulation. The specific tension of navigating spaces where your view is constrained by design rather than by player choice. Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder camera was brilliant for that game's design, but it's a fundamentally different visual language creating different emotional effects. The recent remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 use free cameras rather than fixed perspectives, and they're excellent games, but they're creating different experiences. The fixed camera originals have a distinctive visual style and pacing rhythm that the remakes, for all their strengths, don't replicate. Neither approach is objectively superior. They're different tools for different design goals. What the fixed cameras of classic Resident Evil demonstrate is that limitations can be transformed into strengths through thoughtful design. Capcom couldn't render the mansion in real time three-dimensionally, so they rendered it in two dimensions as backgrounds and found that this enabled better graphics, more careful composition, and directorial control over perspective. They had to use tank controls to make fixed cameras workable, and in doing so created a control scheme that was consistent and reliable once learned. They couldn't let players see everything, so they used that constraint to create surprise and tension. This is the lesson that gets lost when we dismiss old design as dated or clunky. Sometimes those old choices were solving problems in ways that opened up new possibilities. Sometimes the limitations forced creativity that would never have emerged with unlimited technical capacity. Sometimes the constraint was the catalyst for the artistic vision. The fixed cameras in Resident Evil weren't just what the hardware could do. They were what Capcom chose to do with what the hardware could do, and that choice created a visual language that defined survival horror for a decade. The narrative that respects silence. Most video games in 1996 told their stories through text boxes and exposition dumps. Characters would explain plot points at length. Documents would spell out every detail of the backstory. Cutscenes would make sure you understood exactly what was happening and why. Resident Evil did something different. It scattered fragments of story throughout the environment and trusted you to piece together the narrative yourself. The Spencer Mansion doesn't announce its secrets through dramatic reveals. It whispers them through documents, through environmental details, through the arrangement of corpses and the contents of laboratories. You find a researcher's diary documenting the progression of the T-virus infection in their own body, entries becoming less coherent as the virus takes hold. You find letters between Umbrella executives discussing containment procedures and acceptable losses. You find the aftermath of experiments in locked rooms where things clearly went catastrophically wrong. This approach to storytelling respects player intelligence in a way that explicit exposition never can. The game isn't stopping to make sure you understand. It's laying out evidence and letting you draw conclusions. Some players will read every document carefully and construct detailed understanding of Umbrella's research, the T-virus outbreak, and the mansion's true purpose. Other players will skim the documents and just understand the basic situation. Zombies bad, Umbrella responsible, escape mansion. Both experiences are valid. The game accommodates different levels of engagement with its narrative. The document design itself is worth examining. These aren't just text boxes with information. They're styled as actual documents, typed reports, handwritten notes, diary entries. Each has a voice, a person behind it, sometimes degrading in coherence as the author's situation worsens. The researcher's diary that tracks their transformation into a zombie is genuinely disturbing, not because it's graphic, but because it's personal. You're reading someone's final thoughts as they lose their humanity. This creates intimacy that traditional exposition can't achieve. You're not being told about the horrors that happened here. You're reading the words of people who lived through those horrors, written in the moments before they died or transformed. It's horror through primary sources, through evidence left behind by the victims. And because you find these documents while navigating the mansion where these events occurred, the connection between narrative and space is direct and powerful. The environmental storytelling reinforces what the documents suggest. You read about experiments on test subjects, then you find the laboratory with containment cells broken from the inside. You read about researchers trying to escape, then you find their bodies in hallways leading to exits that were sealed. The space confirms the narrative, and the narrative explains the space. They work together to create understanding that's more complete than either could provide alone. The game also uses restraint in what it shows versus what it implies. You never see the initial outbreak. You never witness the moment things went wrong. You arrive after the catastrophe, finding only the aftermath. This is more effective than showing everything explicitly because the imagination fills in details in ways that are personally frightening. Each player constructs their own version of how things fell apart, and those personal imagined scenarios are scarier than any cutscene could be. The multiple endings based on your actions create narrative weight for gameplay decisions. Whether certain characters survive, how quickly you complete the game, which character you played, all of this affects the ending you receive. This makes the narrative feel responsive to your playthrough rather than completely predetermined. Your story is slightly different from another player's story because your choices created different outcomes. The canonical narrative established across multiple games shows that Capcom was thinking about Resident Evil as a long-term franchise with ongoing mythology. The Spencer Mansion incident leads to Raccoon City's destruction in Resident Evil 2 and 3. Characters like Jill, Chris, Leon, and Claire appear across multiple entries, their stories connecting and evolving. Umbrella's crimes accumulate across games until the corporation collapses. This creates a sense that you're experiencing chapters of a larger story rather than disconnected adventures. But even within this franchise mythology, the individual games maintain restraint. They don't over-explain. They don't stop to make sure you've understood how this entry connects to previous ones. They trust that interested players will follow the through lines, while casual players can enjoy each game as a standalone experience. This balance between continuity and accessibility is difficult to achieve, and Resident Evil managed it by keeping the core of each game's story self-contained while layering in connections for invested players. The viral horror at the core of Resident Evil's narrative taps into primal fears about disease, infection, and bodily corruption. The T-virus doesn't just kill, it transforms, it removes humanity, it turns people into mindless predators. This is horror on a biological level, the fear that your own body could betray you, that you could become something monstrous, that the thing making you human could be stripped away, leaving only hunger and violence. The game rarely makes this subtext explicit. It doesn't have characters philosophizing about the nature of humanity or the horror of transformation. but the implications are there in every zombie you encounter. These were people. They had lives, identities, relationships. The virus reduced them to shambling corpses driven by base instinct. You're killing what used to be human, and while the game doesn't dwell on that fact, it's present in the design of the zombies themselves. They wear the clothes of their former lives. They exist in spaces they once occupied as living people. They're monuments to loss of self. The Umbrella Corporation as villain works because it represents institutional evil rather than individual malice. There's no mustache-twirling villain in the Spencer Mansion. Wesker's betrayal is personal, but Umbrella itself is a system, a corporation that prioritized profit and research over ethics and safety. This makes the horror more diffuse, more realistic. You can kill all the zombies and escape the mansion, but Umbrella still exists, still operates, still creates bioweapons. The problem isn't solved by individual heroism, because the problem is structural. Later games in the series expanded on this corporate horror, showing Umbrella's influence across governments, their black market dealings, their web of research facilities and shell companies. The franchise built one of gaming's most detailed evil corporations, with recognizable iconography. The red and white umbrella logo became synonymous with fictional corporate malfeasance. But even in the first game with limited narrative space, the core critique is present. Institutions that treat human life as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of other goals are sources of horror as real as any monster. The voice acting in the original Resident Evil has been mocked endlessly, but it actually serves the narrative in unexpected ways. The stilted delivery and awkward line readings create a sense of unreality, of something slightly off. These people don't quite sound like real people, which creates subtle wrongness that permeates everything. It's not that the performances are so bad they're scary. It's that they exist in this uncanny valley between naturalism and artificiality that makes the whole experience feel dreamlike and strange. The remake's professional voice acting grounds the story in realism, making characters more believable and their situations more relatable. This is generally better for drama and immersion, but the original's weird performances contributed to its distinctive atmosphere in ways that only become apparent when comparing the two versions. The original feels like a B movie, and that B movie energy is part of its charm and its horror. The remake feels like a prestige production, which is technically superior, but tonally different. The way Resident Evil integrated narrative with gameplay was influential beyond just horror games. The idea that story could be discovered through exploration rather than delivered through cutscenes. The documents could provide world building and context without interrupting gameplay. That environmental design could communicate narrative information. These techniques became standard practice across gaming. The BioShock series is built on this foundation. The Dark Souls games use item descriptions and environmental details to tell their fractured narratives. The Last of Us uses environmental storytelling extensively, but Resident Evil proved the concept could work in a mainstream action game with broad commercial appeal. It showed that players would engage with optional documents if they contained interesting information. It demonstrated that you could tell a complex story about corporate malfeasance and biological horror without extended cutscenes or heavy exposition. It respected player intelligence and agency by making narrative engagement optional but rewarding. The restraint in cutscenes is remarkable when compared to modern standards. Resident Evil doesn't stop frequently to show you dramatic scenes. Most of the game is you navigating spaces, finding items, solving puzzles, and occasionally encountering brief cutscenes that advance the plot, or introduce new threats. This keeps the player in control of the experience, maintaining immersion and pacing. You're living through the events rather than watching them. The radio communications with your team members provide narrative updates without breaking gameplay flow. You get brief messages that contextualize your objectives, inform you of other characters' situations, and create the sense that you're part of a larger situation even though you're navigating the mansion alone. These are efficient storytelling beats that deliver information without demanding your full attention, letting you continue exploring while receiving narrative context. The reveal of the mansion's true purpose, not a residence but a research facility, recontextualizes everything you've seen up to that point. Suddenly, the strange layout makes sense. The weird locked doors requiring emblems and keys were security measures. The labs hidden beneath the house were where the real work happened. The mansion was a facade, and you were navigating Umbrella's secrets without realizing the full scope. This kind of narrative reframing creates satisfying moments of understanding, where previously confusing elements suddenly cohere into clarity. The final sequence, escaping before the mansion self-destructs, creates narrative urgency that aligns with gameplay intensity. You're not just running from explosions because that's what happens at the end of action stories. You're escaping because the evidence of Umbrella's crimes is about to be destroyed, because the facility was designed to eliminate all traces if containment failed. The self-destruct sequence has diegetic justification that makes narrative sense while providing exciting gameplay. The helicopter rescue feels earned because you've been separated from your team, navigating alone, occasionally receiving radio contact but mostly isolated. When you finally reunite and escape together, it's relief and victory. The ones who survived made it out, and the implication is heavy. Not everyone did. The game doesn't dwell on losses, doesn't force emotional scenes about fallen teammates, but the absence is felt. This restraint makes the survival of the protagonist feel more precious. The narrative philosophy of Resident Evil, show don't tell, scatter evidence and let players piece it together, respect silence and avoid over-explanation, integrate story with environment and gameplay rather than separating them into cutscenes. This philosophy shaped how narrative-driven games approached storytelling. It proved that environmental narrative and document-based storytelling could carry significant weight. It showed that player agency in discovering story was valuable and engaging. It demonstrated that restraint could be more powerful than exposition. Modern Resident Evil games have moved toward more cinematic storytelling with extensive cutscenes and dramatic character moments. This works for the blockbuster tone of recent entries, but it's a different approach than the original games took. The classics whispered their narratives through blood-stained documents and corpse-filled rooms. The modern entries announce their stories through voice-acted drama and carefully directed scenes. Neither is wrong, but they're creating fundamentally different relationships between player and narrative. What's lost in the shift towards cinematic storytelling is the sense of personal discovery, of being an investigator piecing together evidence rather than an audience being told a story. The original Resident Evil made you work for understanding, and that work made the narrative more memorable because you constructed it yourself from fragments rather than receiving it fully formed. That's a specific kind of storytelling that respects player intelligence and rewards attention in ways that more explicit narrative delivery cannot replicate. The difficulty that teaches Resident Evil's difficulty is often misunderstood as simply being hard, as punishing players through scarce resources and dangerous enemies. But the difficulty is actually a teaching system, one that guides you toward understanding the game's rules and developing the skills needed for mastery. The early game is genuinely difficult for new players, but that difficulty is carefully calibrated to train specific behaviors and instincts. The first zombie encounter in the Spencer mansion is a perfect teaching moment disguised as a horror scene. You find your teammate Kenneth being eaten by a zombie in the hallway. You investigate. The zombie turns, reveals its grotesque face, starts shuffling toward you. You have a handgun. The natural instinct is to shoot it, but here's the lesson. Shooting consumes ammunition, and ammunition is limited. This single zombie takes multiple shots to drop, and once it falls, you're not sure if it's really dead or just temporarily down. This encounter teaches several things simultaneously. Zombies are threats that require resources to eliminate. Combat is inefficient. You can run past enemies. Resource conservation matters from the very start. And perhaps, most importantly, not every threat needs to be eliminated. These lessons aren't explained through tutorial text. They emerge from your experience with this encounter and your reflection on it afterward. The mansion's layout creates a difficulty curve through spatial familiarity. Early areas are confusing and dangerous because you don't know the layout, don't know where enemies are, don't know where safe rooms or resources are located. But as you explore and build spatial knowledge, those same areas become easier to navigate. You know where the zombie is in that hallway, so you can bait its lunge and dodge past. You know where the safe room is, so you can route toward it when you need to reorganize. The game gets easier as you learn its spaces, which is the difficulty curve working as intended. The puzzle difficulty has a similar teaching curve. Early puzzles are relatively simple. Find a key, unlock a door, find an emblem, place it in an obvious slot. These teach you to examine items for hints, to explore thoroughly, to pay attention to environmental cues. Later puzzles build on these lessons, requiring you to combine items, solve multi-step sequences, remember details from documents or dialogue. The difficulty escalates as your puzzle-solving skills develop. The enemy introduction pattern carefully layers threats. You start facing only zombies, learning how they move, how to avoid or fight them efficiently. Then Cerberus hounds are introduced, teaching you that different enemies have different patterns and require different strategies. Hunters appear later, being significantly more dangerous and requiring new tactics. The game doesn't throw all enemy types at you immediately. It introduces them progressively, giving you time to adapt to each new threat before adding the next layer of complexity. Boss fights test your resource management across entire sections. You enter the plant boss fight with whatever resources you conserved through the greenhouse and surrounding areas. If you use too much ammunition on regular enemies, you might struggle with the boss. If you conserved well, you'll have plenty for the encounter. The boss itself isn't teaching resource management, it's testing whether you learn that lesson from the regular gameplay. The difficulty isn't in the boss pattern, but in whether you arrived prepared. The different difficulty modes expand accessibility while maintaining challenge for skilled players. Easy mode provides more resources and reduces enemy damage, making the game completable for players still learning survival horror systems. Normal mode is balanced for players with some experience. Hard mode demands optimization and punishes mistakes. This tiered difficulty means the same game can serve both casual and hardcore audiences, teaching fundamentals on easier modes while testing mastery on harder ones. The game's difficulty is also self-balancing through its interconnected systems. If you're struggling with combat and using lots of ammunition, you'll have less for future encounters. which encourages you to avoid fights and conserve. If you're taking lots of damage, you'll use healing items quickly, which encourages more careful play. The resource economy naturally guides you toward better strategies by making inefficient play increasingly difficult to sustain. The checkpoint system via ink ribbons creates a difficulty modifier through save frequency. Players who save often and use many ribbons might run out, forcing them to complete sections without save safety nets. Players who save rarely conserve ribbons but risk losing more progress on death. The system lets players self-select their difficulty through save behavior. Frequent saving makes the game more forgiving. Rare saving makes it more punishing. Neither is enforced. It emerges from player choice within the constraint of limited ribbons. The unlockable weapons and modes create difficulty, progression beyond the base game. Once you've completed normal mode, you can challenge yourself with hard mode, speed running for better times, or self-imposed restrictions like knife-only runs. The game provides the framework for escalating challenge, but much of it comes from player-driven goals rather than explicit game modes. This creates effectively limitless difficulty ceiling for players who want to master the systems completely. The difficulty teaches patience, something most action games don't prioritize. You can't rush through Resident Evil. Charging forward without careful planning leads to resource exhaustion and death. The game forces you to slow down, think through encounters, plan routes, manage inventory deliberately. This patience isn't boring, it's tense because you're moving carefully through dangerous spaces, making considered decisions under pressure. The difficulty teaches that thoughtfulness is survival. The punishment for failure, losing progress back to your last save, creates stakes that make the difficulty meaningful. You're not just frustrated by dying, you're losing tangible progress that you have to redo. This makes success valuable and failure consequential. The difficulty has weight because the punishment is real. Modern games with unlimited checkpoints can be mechanically challenging, but lack this sense of consequence. Resident Evil's difficulty matters because failure costs you something substantial. The teaching through difficulty extends to speed running and optimization. Your first playthrough might take 10 or 12 hours, but as you learn routes, memorize puzzles, optimize inventory management, and master enemy patterns, you can complete the game in under 2 hours. The game is teaching you that mastery comes through understanding and optimization, not through character leveling or equipment upgrades. Your capability increases through knowledge and skill, which is deeply satisfying progression. The different character playthroughs teach adaptability. Chris and Jill have different capabilities and access to different items. A strategy that works for Jill might not work for Chris. This teaches that there's no single correct approach, that adapting to your available tools and constraints is part of the challenge. The difficulty isn't in learning one optimal path, but in developing flexible understanding that applies across different situations. What Resident Evil demonstrates about difficulty design is that challenge can be a teaching tool rather than just an obstacle. The game is difficult in ways that train you to play better, that encourage specific behaviors, that reward learning and adaptation. The difficulty isn't arbitrary or punishing for its own sake. It's carefully calibrated to create learning moments, to guide you toward understanding the systems, to reward mastery while remaining accessible to persistent players. Modern game design often separates difficulty from teaching, using tutorials to explain systems, and then difficulty settings to adjust challenge. Resident Evil integrates them. The difficulty is the teaching mechanism. You learn by struggling, by making mistakes, by discovering through play what works and what doesn't. This approach respects players enough to let them fail, trusts them to learn from failure, and rewards the learning with genuine satisfaction when success is achieved. The difficulty that teaches is one of Resident Evil's least discussed innovations. It created a model for survival horror challenge that balanced accessibility with depth, that guided learning through carefully crafted encounters, that rewarded mastery without requiring it, and it proved that games could be challenging in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the experience. That difficulty could serve the horror by making survival feel genuinely earned rather than guaranteed. The legacy nobody claims. Here's the strange thing about Resident Evil's influence on game design. It's everywhere, but rarely acknowledged. Dozens of design patterns that are now standard practice trace back to decisions Capcom made in 1996. But those patterns have been absorbed so completely into game design language that their origin is forgotten. Resident Evil created a vocabulary that everyone uses but few credit. The safe room concept, a space within a hostile environment where threats cannot reach you, marked by distinct aesthetic and audio cues, appears across genres now. Dark Souls bonfires, Dead Space workbenches, The Last of Us safe houses, even Fortnite's storm safe zones. These are all descendants of Resident Evil's save rooms, spaces that provide psychological relief through mechanical safety. The idea that horror and tension need pressure release valves, that games should provide breathing room where players can think and plan without immediate threat. This comes directly from Resident Evil's save room design. The item box and storage system influenced inventory design across gaming. The concept that you don't carry everything you find, but instead make strategic decisions about what to carry and what to store. This appears in everything from survival games like The Forest to open-world RPGs like The Witcher 3. The psychological dynamic of deciding what's worth carrying versus what to leave in storage, that originated in survival horror and spread outward as designers realized it created engaging decision-making, environmental storytelling through documents, and scattered evidence became standard practice. Before Resident Evil popularized it, most games told stories through character dialogue and cutscenes. After Resident Evil, games across genres started hiding narrative in journals, computer terminals, audio logs, scattered notes, BioShock's audio diaries, Skyrim's books, System Shock's emails. These are all using the document-based storytelling that Resident Evil refined into effective practice. The interconnected level design with unlockable shortcuts influenced everything from Dark Souls to God of War. The idea that a game world can be a complex, interconnected space where progression opens new paths and creates shortcuts back to familiar areas. This was revolutionary when Resident Evil implemented it. Now it's so common that players expect it, complain when games use pure linear design or hub and spoke structures. But Resident Evil proved that carefully designed interconnected spaces could carry an entire game. The resource economy that forces meaningful choice influenced not just horror games, but survival games as a genre. The explosion of survival crafting games in the 2010s, games like Don't Starve, Subnautica, Rust, they're all built on resource scarcity, creating decision weight. Resident Evil showed that managing limited resources across extended gameplay could be engaging in itself, that scarcity creates emergent challenges beyond just mechanical difficulty. The ranking and unlock systems that reward replaying became standard in action games. Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Metal Gear Solid, countless others use post-completion rankings and unlock rewards. The idea that finishing a game unlocks new content and challenges, creating an improvement loop across playthroughs. Resident Evil didn't invent this, but refined it and proved it could work in narrative-driven games, not just arcade-style score chasers. The alternate scenarios and character perspectives influence narrative games broadly. The idea that experiencing the same events from different perspectives reveals new information and creates deeper understanding. This appears in games as diverse as Resident Evil 2's zapping system, Nier Automata's multiple playthroughs, and Detroit Become Human's branching paths. Resident Evil showed that player choice in perspective could be as meaningful as choice in action. The boss fights as resource checks rather than pure mechanical challenges influenced how designers think about climactic encounters. Instead of bosses being purely about learning patterns and executing correctly, they became tests of preparation and resource management. This appears in survival horror, obviously, but also in games like The Last of Us, where boss encounters test whether you have adequate supplies, or Monster Hunter, where preparation for hunts is as important as execution during them. The cinematic camera angles and fixed perspectives influenced horror games for a decade. Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, Clock Tower all use variations of fixed cameras because Resident Evil proved they could work. Even after horror games moved to player-controlled cameras, the lessons about perspective control and deliberate framing influenced how games thought about camera systems. Dead Space's over-the-shoulder camera is a direct evolution from Resident Evil 4's perspective, which itself was evolving beyond the fixed cameras of earlier entries. The Spencer Mansion, as an iconic video game location, influenced how games think about memorable spaces. Just like people remember Shadow Moses from Metal Gear Solid or Rapture from BioShock, the Spencer Mansion became a character in its own right. This taught designers that carefully crafted, coherent locations with strong identity could be more memorable than sprawling worlds with less distinct areas. Quality of space over quantity of space. The typewriter save point sound became one of gaming's most iconic audio cues, and it demonstrated how sound design could create strong associations. Now games routinely use distinctive sounds for important systems, understanding that audio can create Pavlovian responses that enhance engagement. The typewriter sound trained players to feel relief at a specific audio cue, and that technique is now widely employed. The difficulty, through constraint rather than complex mechanics, influenced indie game design particularly. Games like Amnesia, Outlast, Alien Isolation all use severe limitations on player capability to create challenge. You can't fight effectively or at all. You have limited resources. You're forced to make hard choices under pressure. This design philosophy traces directly to classic survival horror, to Resident Evil teaching that limitation creates engagement. The B-movie aesthetic and willingness to be campy while maintaining genuine scares influenced horror across media. Resident Evil proved you could have ridiculous dialogue, absurd plotting, and over-the-top scenarios while still creating effective horror. This opened space for horror that wasn't self-seriously grim, that could embrace pulp sensibilities while delivering genuine frights. You see this in games like Dead Rising and in films influenced by gaming's tonal flexibility. Yet despite this massive influence, Resident Evil rarely gets credited in discussions of game design innovation. People talk about how Dark Souls revolutionized level design without acknowledging Resident Evil did it first. People praise BioShock's environmental storytelling without mentioning the documents and scattered evidence in survival horror. People celebrate The Last of Us's resource scarcity without tracing it back to survival horror's economy design. Part of this is because Resident Evil's innovations were genre-specific initially. They were seen as horror game mechanics, not broadly applicable design patterns. But as those mechanics proved engaging beyond just horror, they spread to other genres and lost their association with the source. Resident Evil became a victim of its own success. The design patterns it pioneered became so widespread that they stopped being notable, stopped being connected to their origin. Part of it is also because Resident Evil's later entries moved away from these design patterns. 4, 5, and 6 were action games with horror elements rather than survival horror. This made it easy to view classic Resident Evil as an early phase the series moved past, rather than as foundational design that influenced everything that followed. When a franchise abandons its own innovations, those innovations become orphaned in design history, influential but unclaimed. The recent remakes have reintroduced classic Resident Evil design to new audiences while modernizing the execution. The Resident Evil 2 remake showed that interconnected level design, resource scarcity, and carefully crafted horror spaces still work brilliantly with contemporary graphics and controls. It reminded the industry that these weren't just old ideas superseded by better approaches. They were strong ideas that had been temporarily abandoned in favor of different design goals. What the unclaimed legacy of Resident Evil teaches us is that influence is often invisible. The most successful design innovations don't feel like innovations. They feel obvious, natural, just how things are done. Resident Evil changed game design so thoroughly that its changes stopped being recognizable as specific to Resident Evil. The patterns it established became the default, the baseline everyone works from. This is simultaneously the highest compliment and a strange erasure. Resident Evil succeeded so completely at teaching game design what survival horror could be that those lessons became just what games do. The safe rooms, the resource economies, the environmental storytelling, the interconnected spaces, these stopped being Resident Evil innovations and became just game design fundamentals. The franchise wrote the textbook that everyone now learns from without remembering who wrote it. And perhaps that's fine. Perhaps the point of great design isn't to be remembered for specific innovations, but to change the landscape so thoroughly that the innovations become invisible. Resident Evil doesn't need credit for every game that uses safe rooms, or resource scarcity, or document-based storytelling. Its legacy isn't in recognition, it's in how completely it changed what games could be, what horror could be, what player choice and resource management and spatial design and difficulty curves could accomplish. The legacy nobody claims is still a legacy. It's written into the design DNA of hundreds of games across multiple genres. It's present every time a game asks you to make a meaningful choice under scarcity, every time a space becomes memorable through careful design, every time environmental storytelling replaces explicit exposition, every time difficulty teaches rather than just punishes. Resident Evil is in the foundations, supporting structures you interact with constantly without noticing the support. That's the best kind of influence. Invisible, inevitable, essential. Not the influence that demands credit, but the influence that becomes infrastructure. Resident Evil built foundations that the entire medium now stands on, and the fact that those foundations are invisible doesn't diminish them. It proves how solid they were, how essential they remain, how completely they've been integrated into what games are and what they can do.